Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Adkins, and I am the Graduate Associate for the GSWS program for the academic year 23 to 24. I'm also a PhD candidate in East Asian Languages and Civilizations Department. I'm here to introduce us to our next panel and the moderator for our next panel. The panel is on the Trans Oral History Project, which is scholars and advocates collaboratively initiative among the FQT Center, the Kislak Center, and Philadelphia's William Way Community Center. The moderator for this panel is Kat Dawson, PhD. Kat Dawson works at the intersection of art history and feminist, queer, and trans studies, exploring the cultural production of minoritized subjects in the 20th and 21st century. Their first book, which is titled Monumental: Race, Sexuality, Representation, Culture, is forthcoming from MIT Press. Their second book, titled Transform, has been solicited by MIT. They are currently guest faculty in art history at Sarah Lawrence College. Please join me in welcoming.
No, it's great. You got it. Good morning, folks, or good afternoon, everyone. How are you? My name is Kat. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Caitlin. I'm really excited for this panel on the Trans Oral History Project. And since its general purpose has been introduced already to a degree, I want to go ahead and get started. What we've decided to do at the wonderful recommendation of one of our panelists, Che, is to organize our time today into the categories of past, present, and future, to give you all a sense of where this project came from, where it is right now, and the ways in which it is growing and moving into where it will be in future years. And how we've decided to introduce ourselves is to do so when we speak. So because we have quite a big panel, folks will just introduce themselves when they offer their first set of comments. So I want to get going on the past of the project to give a sense of its history, ethics, and stakes. And I look forward to hearing from Maria, Liz, and Che. So take it away, Maria.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maria. Is this picking me up okay? More Gwendolyn? And some of you may know I have this voice modulator that pitch shifts my voice, and I use it so much now that it's become like I'm becoming dependent on this voice that like shifts into, it's like my daddy alter ego. And I actually feel like this would have gone better if I came as daddy. But I'm going to go on. So I'm Maria. I'm the former Associate Director of the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies. And I want to just provide a really short introduction to the project and share a few gentle reflections about its origins. Some of the questions and concerns that shaped some of the early decisions about how we were going to frame the Trans Oral History Project, its scope and methods, but also a few more logistical the important but mundane administrative logistics that are also end up having an outsized impact, I think, on the scope of the project. So as Caitlin let us know, the Trans Oral History Project is a community engagement initiative that records and makes publicly accessible the stories of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. It's a city campus partnership between the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies, the William Way LGBT Center, Community Center, and the Kislak Center. In many ways, the permutations and the budding goals of this project mirrored the ways in which the FQT Center, which at the time was called the Alice Paul Center, was trying to recast its work. In spring 2021, the center was changing its name and making moves to more explicitly demonstrate both the structural and political scope of its classes and programs, and thinking strategically about transformative possibilities to move the needle at an institution like Penn. So how to effect impactful or really any kind of change within institutional constraints, some of which you have already heard about at the symposium. So in fall 2021, we convened an advisory board to establish the parameters of the archive, determining the project ethos, to organize how this project could be co-created and co-owned with community members. As I'm sure won't surprise anyone here, the list we compiled of what we wanted to not do to avoid the anxieties and concerns about this project being potentially extractive, what problems might be perpetuated, reconstituted, even strengthened by hosting a project like this at Penn, that list was, unsurprisingly very long. At the same time, we indulged in imagining what kinds of transformations could be possible, maybe even politically operable, by creating an oral history project that could be both a resource and a critical contribution to redressing how histories of gender expansion have been medicalized, commodified, and erased. When the TOHP was getting off the ground, the FQT Center was also grappling with how to shape what actual material commitments we needed to accompany the land acknowledgements that we had started offering at events. We were imagining and reshaping our commitments to try to better reflect Indigenous models of land stewardship and striving to counter models of possession, ownership, and extraction. For example, by putting center resources toward efforts to pressure Penn to make payments in lieu of taxes and asking ourselves how these models could inform what might take shape with this project, where library stewardship of resources and materials needed to be drastically rethought. Some of these concerns were purely technical. What medium would we use? Audio recordings can be small, compressed. They're easy to manage on the front end of a website, for example. For some community members, video recordings might be a preferred medium to reflect their stories beyond their voices alone. Other ongoing technical concerns include how the metadata for recordings would be tagged and updated as language is rapidly shifting. Part of this comes down to also what Penn's mandate is versus, for example, what the William Way Center's mandate is and how that might impact how we store data. At the same time, as we were working on this, we were getting familiar with other queer and trans archival projects that have managed to find creative ways to sidestep some of these complications and to forge new relational modes through which to build community and community resources. When Nat DiFrank and Nat Rivkin, who's not here, but she'll be here later, the Nat Dream Team, joined this project in spring 2022, we began the very slow work of outlining those particulars. And so I know Nat will talk about their work with Morris Home today, and Darius is going to talk about the relationship with William Way. And I'm really excited to learn where the project is headed since wiser queers than I have taken the reins. But I do want to share one last thought about one thing I learned while working to establish this project. One insight I learned primarily from my dear colleague, Gwendolyn Beetham, is that care-oriented work, any labor of care, or rather to do labor with care within the university must begin by imagining and figuring out what is and is not possible within the university context. A context informed by institutional priorities for community-engaged research that can co-opt community expertise and perpetuate extractive research histories of which, we get conscripted into. Instead, I learned from my involvement in these early days of the project that care-oriented work with communities, the kind of work that seeks to form better or to form at all or better cultivate meaningful touch points across different modes of relation must be done in good faith and slowly. Thank you.
I don't know. Is there I think Liz was gonna take this from here. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Pat, and thank you, Maria. My name is Liz Rose. Can you all hear me? We're gonna keep doing this. Check. My name is Liz Rose. I'm a doctoral student in comparative literature and literary theory, and I'm the graduate associate on the Philly Trans Oral History Project, along with Nat Rivkin, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today. And I was actually first introduced to the project in 2021 when Maria invited me to join the advisory board. And I'll just also mention my personal stakes in the project relate to an investment in creating space for a multiplicity of trans narratives, especially ones that don't conform to assumed linear trajectories, and also creating space for trans folks to form community together and connections. And As Maria kind of mentioned, the advisory board was an early meeting place for folks doing trans organizing and advocacy in Philly, and also folks at Penn to discuss the ethical questions, framing, and infrastructure of this project. And some of those ethical questions included how could Penn best house and fund this project given the university's extractive relationship with Philadelphia? How could we best connect with community partners? And one of the key components of that was creating the job of the project manager and hiring the brilliant Nat DiFrank, who's already committed to trans community building and healing work in Philadelphia. And then another really big component of those early conversations was how to compensate participants and create a project by and for trans folks. This also included conversations with Kislak around preservation access and metadata, as Maria mentioned. And then more recently, last academic year, we had community listening parties at William Way to try to create spaces for listening and sharing among trans folks in Philadelphia. And then also just looking into longer term funding solutions for the project to make sure that the project can continue functioning into the future. So, you know, I'll just stop there and maybe pass it to Kat or whoever.
To Nat, actually. Thank you so
Great.
much, Liz. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
hi. Oh,
I was just going to say, I believe I made a mistake. I think Che was going to take us to the next segment, if you wouldn't mind speaking about stakes a little bit.
sure. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Maybe I'll just like talk like this. I've been in, well, it's sort of, I used to live in Philly. I've been kind of orbiting Penn and orbiting Philly for the past like decade. So I moved, I was in graduate school here for a short while. I was in a history program, realized that even though I love archives, I didn't want to be a historian. But I kind of, so I like got my MA and was a kind of promiscuous academic and took classes in English. That was great. And a lot of what I did here was actually forms of activism. So that kind of is part of my genealogy, my political genealogy in terms of my relationship to this project. So when I lived here, I worked with groups like Hearts on a Wire, which is a trans abolitionist group that still exists in Philadelphia, that does work against mass incarceration in general and hyper incarceration of Black and brown, low income trans folks in Pennsylvania. And it's a collective organization that is volunteer based. And I also worked with other kind of trans activist groups that were challenging city politics. So one of them was a loose collective called RAGE, Riders Against Gender Exclusion, because at that time, SEPTA, the transit system, trans people were being denied access to like go home, for example, or go to work based on gender markers that were used to exclude and reject people from having access to public transit. And so a coalition formed that included trans activists, that included AIDS activists from ACT UP Philadelphia. And we were able to, through like years of struggle and organizing, get those gender markers removed. So that was like a big event and really a flashpoint for trans organizing in Philly. And so part of what motivates me in this project is kind of historicizing the ways in which trans people in Philadelphia have shaped city politics, both at a kind of macro scale and then a small scale too. And part of what trans oral history does is it kind of, aside from the macro, you know, these interventions into our understanding of like urban politics or sociality, is it also kind of generates community and reduces isolation, which is a really important kind of intervention, especially given our political conjuncture right now. And so I think I'm really interested in this project in thinking about how do we get at the different decades and experiences of trans history, and figures like Charlene Arcilla and C. Bell and Black trans women who have really been central players in trans politics in Philly. And trans politics in Philly isn't as kind of documented as other places like, for example, New York. And so we've partnered with, the New York Trans Oral History Project and done workshops with them as a way to think about like, how is our work connected to what's going on in other cities as well. So that's just some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Jay. And thank you for bringing us into the present, because that's where we're headed next. In terms of framing the present, I want to hand this to Eva to talk a little bit about what, to this place where Che left us, what, to use our phrase from our meeting, what trans can do for oral history. So what does it mean in particular to find oneself outside of history, and how can that inform oral history as a method?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you. My name is Eva. I'm the postdoc fellow with the Trans Oral History Project. And I'm gonna hold this actually. It's a little diva move, but we're gonna do it. I found my way into the Trans Oral History Project through my own work. So I am a scholar, but we're going to downplay that. I'm also a performer, showgirl, and pole instructor. So I work in terms of dance and movement, especially with like erotic labor and nightlife industries more broadly, as well as organizing with different sex work communities, particularly trans sex workers. And so I think that one of the approaches that is really important to me is that trans life is most often, if it is included in the archive, right? Because the archive is also a source of epistemicide when it comes to trans subjects, but which I'll come back to. But when it comes to approaching or gleaning trans life within the archive, so frequently it's encountered through official documents, whether that's a medical record, whether that's a kind of like letter for a request or approval of medical access, whether it's in the form of ethnographies carried out by academics who do not belong to the communities in which they are creating knowledge and producing knowledge and selling knowledge, as well as the more popularly consumed forms of media, like which might not be in the archive, but are also in the archive, which we kind of got into yesterday with Alicia's presentation. Porn, which is like so overrepresented among trans and gender non-normative subjects. And so one of the key approaches to, I think, thinking about ethics in relation to the Trans Oral History Project is like, what does it enable when we try to create an archive that's also for trans people and for trans communities? And how does that require different kinds of shifts in thinking about access to the archive, and also how the archive is shaped? Other things that I wanted to touch on include, I think that we're also in a moment where oral history is something that a lot of folks are turning to. Especially in Philadelphia, there's also a drag oral history project that's coming up that's really exciting. And I think oral history brings something to, brings a kind of challenge to anything that we might think of as an official record, to include the vernacular, to include that which is not taken as like correct or taken as respectable. And documenting that as legitimate forms of expression and actually like salient necessary idioms that have enabled life in forms that we may identify as trans today, right? But that also operate under a lot of other identifications, as the last panel kind of touched on. And this question of what trans brings to oral history is particularly rich And I don't know that I have an answer to it, but I think that for me, it comes back to this question of method and thinking about also oral history as, and an oral history archive as like not just encompassing testimony, even though that is one of its most powerful inclusions in the quote unquote archive, but also thinking about performance, also thinking about all of these, right? Like in my own research, I studied lip syncing, which is a trans femme art form that was created by street queens in the 50s and 60s. And so thinking about all these other ways that trans people have been documenting themselves and have been storytelling and story sharing with and among one another, and finding a way to bring that into the fold in a kind of oral history project in ways that it hasn't necessarily been thought of. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Eva. Sort of an inverse to this question of what's going on within the archive, what is possible within an oral history, right? Is the location of the oral history project itself. And I think one of the things that we've noted throughout the project dating back to when I was here several years ago and was getting underway, but which came up in our preparatory meeting for this panel today, was that this trans oral history project may be unique in being located in a center for feminist, queer, and trans research. So I was hoping to hear from, and then also it's working between this institution of Penn and with the Morris Home and William Way. So I was hoping to hear from Nat and Darius about these various co-locations and how it inflects the project.
Hello, I'm Nat DiFrank, and I'm the project manager. The way I would like to start with like introducing how I got to the project as well. So I have a master's in education, human sexuality studies, but primarily my work has been in care work, doing direct care work with people, with neurodivergent folks, as well as folks who are in recovery. When I got this, when I actually found out even about the position, I was doing a midnight to 8 a.m. shift at Morris Home and Googled transgender jobs and got this, which was fitting. I didn't think it was real, but before that, I guess I should really establish Morris Home. So Morris Home is the only recovery home in the United States that specifically supports trans and non-binary individuals. It comes with, they really focus on harm reduction and support folks who are living at the intersections of like drug use as well as homelessness. And so I was a recovery specialist for there, and during my short time at Morris Home, we experienced an immense amount of loss on a consistent basis. One that became very difficult to sit with as individuals and also felt very heavy. Morris Home is interesting because not only does it serve trans individuals, but the majority, I think the last statistic I saw is 90% of staff is trans themselves. So during my work there, it became really obvious how much we felt a sense of responsibility to continue the stories of so many people who have been lost, especially those who might not be what we stereotypically see within trans narratives of like the celebrities and academics who get their names in books published and things like that, which are wonderful. But so my work here was largely, and my inspiration for like even applying for this job was figuring out a way to preserve the histories and stories and the ingenuity of like the many people I worked with at Morris Home, but also the history of how Morris Home started, which was in honor of Niza Morris. Starting this, I thought a lot about particularly working with a staff member there, Noreen, who still works there. And she was telling me she would tell me stories of like what she heard of what it felt like to be in the room with Niza Morris. The grace she held, the way that she was a mother to so many women within trans women within the Philadelphia community, and the aura she just had in the space. So those moments really are what have inspired me in my work within the Trans Oral History Project, to find a way to preserve that and also a way to share the responsibility of remembering the so many people that we have lost due to the state-sanctioned violence against trans and gender nonconforming individuals. So I take my work here. I didn't have an oral history background. It was much more like education and again, care work. So I see this project as an extension of care work as a way to really hold and create space for people to feel like they can share and be remembered in the ways that they want to. Throughout the process, I've been figuring out methodology, both by looking at like other projects like the New York Trans Oral History Project, but as well as just listening to narrators as we go individually in these interviews. And like Maria stated, we've been really intentional about moving slowly as a purposeful stance of figuring out, you know, what is the best way to navigate these kind of treacherous waters of Penn supporting the trans community in Philadelphia, and particularly, so as I've held many, I feel like this position has held like many things of juggling of just like the archive itself, but also the interview process, as well as figuring out how to get the archive to be accessible to people beyond academic researchers, since most trans and gender nonconforming people are not within academia. So as we've continued and like established that we're still, I feel like, laying the foundation for the project of and are learning as we go. I think a big part of what I did was starting a collection dedicated to Morris Home, current and past like staff and residents, which we'll hear at the end, like a clip from a past resident of Morris Home, Keon Winston. And yeah, so as we've gone on, we've also expanded, and with Che and like the connections Che's have, but also the inspiration of their work of working with like political or like politically organizing like trans folks in the early 2000s. We've been connecting more and more to different collectives and organizations like that are run by trans folks. Recently, we're like working on an event with the Philly Trans March, and we've also connected the Bantu House and other organizations like the Coalition for Black Trans Economic Liberation on creating events that can really uplift the continued work that's mostly centered around like mutual aid and as well as preserving the histories of these individual collectives and people within them. Yeah, I guess so. As we continue, we're figuring out ways to create more and more access points for people who are outside of like the Penn community, of figuring out, which is a big point of William Way, and like having, which I started with, is having community listening sessions where trans folks and gender nonconforming folks from Philly were invited to come to William Way. We gave them like small like gift, and we asked them, like, what would they want to hear from the archive? What would they want to hear from trans elders? And what things did they feel was missing from the narrative, from trans narratives that they hear commonly? We continue to have those as it's like a flexible, and we keep this project moving to form the shape of like the needs of the individuals that make up this archive. And as we continue on, we're also adding in ways that we can connect to both, like we've worked with Penn various like classes, connected gender studies, and students there, informing them about the project. Our first like group of interviews were actually led by students in one of Maria's classes last spring. And now we're moving towards including more volunteer work, and we started our first, had our first volunteer training, have our first little cohort of volunteers who are going to start leading these interviews and being a part of that. So a big part, a big aspect of this is figuring out a way to really like bridge the academia to like trans folks and community in Philly.
That's probably a good transition.
Yeah, there you go, Darius.
So my name is Darius McClean. I am a doctoral candidate in the Educational Leadership Program at St. Joe's, and I'm also the Chief Operating Officer at William Way and the Director of the Arcilla Adams Trans Resource Center. And within the William Way Center, we have the John Wilkes Archives, which is how we were involved in the project initially. My colleague John Andrews and I were on the initial advisory committee. Some of the things, there's going to be a lot of intersections and overlaps here. So we house programs like Hearts on a Wire. They use our Trans Resource Center to do their mailing, and Che told you a little bit about what they do. We also have programming for trans folks there, and we always prioritize the folks that live at the Morris home. When I was approached by Maria, because Maria was the first one there. One of the things I appreciated was that she didn't center her voice and wanted to find ways to center the community that they were going to be working with directly. And then we got Nat, which was wonderful. I didn't know you just were transgender. I should try that next time I'm looking for a job and see what pops up. But we've been talking, I guess I'm going to talk more about systems, and all of you have some relationship to the Penn system, and it was there are a lot of constraints. But in my role at my job, I don't have to follow the Penn constraints in the same way. So I think that's what I saw my role as, is like, you all can't give stipends to people. You can't use a caterer that is a Black-owned caterer or a trans-owned caterer. And my stipulations are, if we are working with you all, then we need to be prioritizing the communities that you all are soliciting for this. So a lot of that partnership looked like, because it's not really giving them money for their time, we were thinking more of, what does it take for you to get to the community center to be able to have this conversation with us? So making sure that they had money for transportation and that there were food at all of the events. And not only were we making sure that there was food at the events, the food was catered by a trans run and owned business. It was unfortunate that we had to do those things. And I would say, I'm not sure what administrators are in here, right? Because faculty, we can have all the desire that we want, but it doesn't matter unless it's decision-making people. And you all here hold it really tight, right? And you give the money to Airmark before you'll give it to these smaller places. And it would save you, and you'd be putting into the communities that you say you want to serve and want to fill their cups. So, and I feel like that's what this team has been doing. And we've had to work together to kind of figure out the ways to do that. And we're still working together to figure out the ways to do that, with making that information accessible to the community. Because, and that's a thing about oral history, right? Is that it's more accessible on many levels, whether it's to the trans community or you all in this room and academics, because we are not all coming from the same spaces of learning and of receiving information. I've also found that it's important to, the one thing as a community center we are is a container and a space, and we're supposed to uphold and make room for people. And that's something that we've been able to collaborate with you all in doing, and giving a safer space, because I know if you all asked me to come tell my history at Penn, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to feel as comfortable sitting in this space. It's a little bit more sterile than the community center, though, we're a little dusty there sometimes, William Way, but it's still a space that folks are used to. And then also full transparency that at the community center, we have historically majorly served gay cis white men. And through the Trans Oral History Project and the Trans Resource Center, we've been trying to shift that and prioritizing BIPOC and trans folks within the center. So I guess our responsibility, or what we've brought to this partnership, has been really the things that you all, and by you all I mean Penn as an institution, have made it kind of impossible for Maria and Nat and Che to do in this work, which is centering and putting into the trans community and not just taking from them. Because I hear what Nat and everyone is saying, but we are still taking, whether it's beneficial or not for the community. And we are going to be we get more out of this all the time. And I don't think it's often acknowledged, and that we often think we're doing something for someone, and it's just not the case. So I guess all is to say is that I am the person that tries to break the rules, I guess, or like the workaround for that shouldn't have to be. And even with us trying to figure out how this information can be shared, like, to me, it makes more sense for these archival histories to be living at the William Way Center as opposed to University of Pennsylvania. And I also would think that it's a responsibility of the University of Pennsylvania to want it housed at the William Way archives, and to pass that information there. But that's still a fight that we're having. And it's not a fight, it's just it shouldn't be something that we have to question, right? Or think, oh, is this an idea? It should have been like, why wasn't it there? Or how could we have put the funding here so that Penn can do this project on site at the William Way Center, and host folks like the Morris Home, Hearts on a Wire, Trans March, Galay, their TINGS program. There are lots of programs here in Philadelphia serving trans folks. And what I can see Nat and Che doing is building those relationships with our community outside of it. And that's why we have been a space to give them the physical space. And it's something that they can always have without question. So that I don't really feel like there are any safe spaces, but we can make a safer space for people to come into.
Thank you so much, Darius. I really appreciate that. Speaking of laboring and service, I wanted to invite Liz, Che, and Nat, in whatever order you would like to speak, to share a little bit about some of the concrete programming and initiatives underway today.
I can. Yeah. So our concrete programming that we have today, one is like our volunteer training that we're trying to move to like monthly basis of continuously working with individuals who are interested in the project. We have pamphlets that we get that a lot of people have access to here that we keep at William Way, where we actually receive the most of like people who are interested in volunteering for the project is from people who've gone to William Way and seen those. We also work with various like courses within gender studies. We've shifted away from focusing on the interviews there and more of like getting students to be a part of the archival process of the materials, including like transcription work, metadata, and creating aspects of like as we're creating our website, which is not finished yet, but as we work on that, we're figuring out ways that we can include things like pages on trans Philadelphia history and just create more ways of interacting with the archive and taking what we learn from that archive to make it accessible for others to interact with. The other thing we've been working on is creating various like collections. We started with Morris Home, but we're now working on a collection that's going to be focused on rage, which is what Che mentioned earlier. And we're also in talks with working on with the Philly Trans March and other collectives as a way of establishing, and like the Queers for Palestine, as a way to really historicize the organizing efforts. But we're also working with individuals who sign up through like our pamphlet as well, who are interested in interviewing. Yeah, our main thing of prioritizing, we prioritize people who are considered elders, where we've kind of changed what people I think normatively considers elders because of the realities of like trans life, is that it's more centered around people who are like above the age of like 30, that we prioritize for creating interviews. And as we go on, we're figuring out ways to create like events that we're mostly looking at working with William Way on, where people can both hopefully continue like sharing stories who are past narrators, or how we can bring in people from various collectives just to give space to really emphasize community work that's been going on already in Philadelphia.
I can add a little about just the ongoing week-to-week work that all of us do that is a lot less sexy than this project might sound. Part of that, and we already kind of mentioned working with the New York Trans Oral History Project, but also doing trainings with other oral history centers and projects, just to gain more expertise and kind of solidify the materials we have for training volunteers. Working also in the realm of expertise, working with the research data and digital scholarship team, which includes Cassandra Hadril and Cynthia Hyder, for thinking about website maintenance and infrastructure, because that's, just these like skill sets we don't necessarily have. And then also having some really in-depth conversations about what digital tagging should look like in a project like this. which means what sorts of words should we make available digitally for searching, right? How do we make the project accessible for all types of research? And how do we include our narrators in some of those conversations, right? How would our narrators tag themselves, so to speak? What kinds of identities and kind of keywords and umbrella terms might they use to describe their experiences? So this is a really, really complex and slow work, as you can imagine. Yeah, and also just, straight up building a website through a digital humanities fellowship through the Price Lab. Nat Rivkin, who can't be here with us right now, has worked a lot on the website building, which again, as you can imagine, is somewhat tedious, but also really important in thinking about the outward facing aspect of this project as being, one of the core tenets of the project. Yeah.
Shay, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just, well, it's not really about what's underway, but I think the sense of potential, given that like this gives us the opportunity to work against the grain of institutional strictures. So be it Penn or be it William Way, that like, thinking up together like new spaces for trans oral history and like what we want to document is that kind of partnership I feel like is rare and important.
Can I add just
Please,
one thing?
please.
I think so. We're in March now, right? So Trans Day of Visibility is coming up, and I think the thing that's really cool about this project is that so our archives, it's lacking in our trans history overall, and a lot of it is history of those that have passed already. And Che had mentioned C. Bell earlier, and we actually we paid staff to go into her apartment with hazmat suits because they were going to condemn it to retrieve those things. So why was she living in these conditions and none of us knew, right? And none of us were taking her history then and putting these things in the archives. And the thing that the Trans Oral History Project is doing, it's telling our stories and giving the flowers while we're here as opposed to when we're not. And I think that's really important and something, again, like work that should continue to be supported. And I feel like I had to say that in addition to what Che was saying and to acknowledge that, it shouldn't be, I often feel personally that Trans Day of Visibility is more for you all, right? To bring visibility to us and for you all to learn a little bit more. But for me, it's just a day where everyone's asking me, what does Trans Day of Visibility mean to you? So keeping that in mind, I think it's important to support projects like this, where we're preserving history every day. We do it with almost every other aspect of historical events. So yeah, that's it.
That's a fabulous segue, and thank you both so much for that, because it's a great way to move on to our final element, which is about the future. And one of the things that has become evident through our conversations is the degree to which, right, this begins as a trans oral history project, which may sound like a discrete entity, but it has grown these other legs and imaginaries and possibilities. So I want to invite you all to sort of speak to some of the things that this has spun off for you.
Well, Nat doesn't know this yet because we're in the middle of a capital campaign, so they haven't had the space the way they're used to accessing, but we've got more on our timeline now. So you guys, the timeline is extended. So now we can hold that space where they can continue to grow the programs and all of those things. So now y'all have more time in the Trans Resource Center
Yeah.
than we.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, some ideas that we've had have really been inspired also by like the volunteers that we've had, who honestly are very eager to be working with trans elders themselves and hear these stories and be a part of that, which I think is one of the most interesting parts. I've been a part of so many different volunteering things, and most people are doing it in some way to put it on their resume. But I find that the volunteers that we actually are working with are very interested in figuring out not only to be a part of this project in the ways that we've already created, but also to think of beyond that, of how they can interact with and work with the material. We've had people suggest things such as like working on quilt projects of portraits of all of the narrators who we are working with. We've also, Che and I have been in talks of things of like creating book clubs where we can actually focus on trans authors at William and work with William Way to hold space for that. Just because as we work with more volunteers, so many folks don't even haven't had like the access or to like the words of other trans like academics and things like that. Yeah, and as we continue, we just really are thinking about ways that we can really support, where we can keep like supporting individuals of like where, like what does it mean to like hold these stories, but also like give space for folks who are really interested. Because not only is it the volunteers who are eager, it's also our narrators are very eager. We've yet to find somebody who's not willing to sit for over an hour and be really interested in sharing every piece of seemingly very vulnerable aspects of their lives in order to, in some ways, claim and be able to make a choice on how they want to be remembered, because I think so many people have that in their thoughts of the ways that people might contrive their lives or things like that, and other meanings beyond their own. Yeah, but
Can I just add, like on that point, a longer term vision would be also training narrators who are excited about participating as volunteers to be interviewers themselves, right? And to learn the oral history methods in order to hold that space for, you know, friends, community members, et cetera.
Jay, Eva, final remarks?
One of the things that I'm also like super jazzed about with the oral history project, and also the approach that I think William Way and Nat DiFrank really have centered with the Philly Trans Oral History Project is the necessity of just creating public space. That we're also, right, like we're also in a time where the public has been under siege in so many ways, and it's few and far between the kinds of space that folks and youth in particular can just be around other queer trans folks, particularly trans people of color. And so I think that one of the right, like as a performer myself, and as a kind of scholar who really believes in the power of art and trans art forms, that I love the initiative with the Philly Trans Oral History Project also to create alongside these listening sessions, these kinds of gathering spaces, these kinds of ways to share with and among one another. And it doesn't have to always be as kind of academic or like theoretical as just like sharing a meal or watching, you know, archival footage together, or reflecting on like a shared text or something like that. Like I think that has for many trans people ourselves, it has a monumental impact in like when we started to see different facets of ourselves. And I think that also is like such an important creation that we can help foster, particularly when reflecting on like Penn's legacy and contributing to the kinds of dispossession, displacement, and enclosure that are continuing to like take away public space or gathering space.
I would just say, you know, I think, Nat, you mentioned like book clubs or kind of spaces of trans study that are, you know, both academic and outside of and, you know, adjacent to. So that's an exciting kind of prospect for the future. I think also something about, you know, pedagogy is important here. And so there's a history of this project collaborating with, you know, it's under the umbrella of WSGS. So it's like there are collaborations between folks teaching trans studies, queer theory, and that becomes a kind of co-thinking of these methodologies. And that to me is really important. And generative. Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing that back to pedagogy. That's fabulous. Do one of you want to do we have this clip queued up?
Yeah, I can.
Do you want to introduce that, Nat? And I'll, oh.
Now, that was Keon Winston, who also goes by Reds, who is someone I'm very close to, who definitely was there during the part of even like applying for this position. And yeah, his interview will be up publicly once we have our website together. And I'd really encourage people to listen to that as well as others. But yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists profoundly. I also want to note that I was involved just in such a minor way in this project at the very beginning. I had the honor of being on the advisory board for half a year. And I'm incredibly moved by the work that you all have been doing on this, the work that is being done. It's an incredibly powerful project. If you want to support this project, you can do so by supporting GSWS. If you take your brochure and you flip it over, you can scan this QR code. And it would be wonderful if you all would join me the moment I step off of this in supporting the project. Before we go, I just want to introduce Lisa Foster, who is the director of Penn Women's Center. Elisa joined the Penn Women's Center in 2017, where she supports and advocates for gender equity among all areas of the campus community. She was appointed the director of the Penn Women's Center in 2023 and is excited to continue the center's mission of providing a space for healing, growth, solidarity, and joy. Prior to her career in higher education, Elisa worked in strategic planning, fundraising, and market research for nonprofit and educational organizations. So I hope you'll join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists and also welcoming Elisa at the same time.
Thank you. I didn't realize I was getting the full introduction. Thank you so much. That panel was so moving to me. As you just read in my bio, I have my roots in nonprofit work. So just hearing about the struggles, about working at Penn and all the bureaucracy that involves, that hit home for me. But I just wanted to take a couple of minutes before we transition to lunch to plug a few things that are coming up that are happening here on campus. I want to draw your attention to this postcard that is at the registration table. It might have been in your program. I also want to, this was actually a very good transition to talking about another oral history project that the Women's Center started for their 40th anniversary 10 years ago, called Voices of Change. And if you have visited the archive exhibit, you could see the highlight video of that playing. But one of the goals for the 50th anniversary is to add to that collection of stories and voices. So if you're interested in contributing to that, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on the Women's Center team. We'll be working on that this semester. But on this paper, one of the things that I appreciate most about working at the Women's Center and our collaborations with GSWS is that we are able to work with students who are taking coursework in GSWS and provide space and mentorship for them to take their education and to put it into practice in real time here on campus. So we wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to learn and invite you all to be involved in some of the things that are happening this spring. In a couple of weeks, we'll start Page Gender Equity Week. The Penn Association for Gender Equity is working hard during their spring break next week to make sure that there is a full slate of wonderful programming that they'll have that'll be open to the entire Penn community and outside community as well. Part of the week will be our annual Take Back the Night march and rally through campus. Again, we work with the students to offer this opportunity to support survivors of sexual violence on campus, and they are always most appreciative when faculty and administrators and alumni come out to support them at that march. So you are all invited to that as well. Another really important event happening in a few weeks is another student-led program, a newer group, Penn Repro Justice, that got really active a few years ago after some important events that happened. We'll be having a very timely conversation on March 23rd about reproductive justice, and we're really proud of them. We're really proud to mentor them and work with them through the planning of that conference. They have a fantastic lineup of panels and speakers. And then to round out the semester in April, a student who actually works at the Women's Center, Luke Godsey, spent winter break creating a quilt for us made out of repurposed materials that were donated by people in this community to represent the Women's Center. And we'll be having an unveiling and a celebration and an artist talk and conversation to talk about the importance of craft to social movements and building communities. So we're really looking forward to that happening in April 12th. And then we'll end out the spring with a big celebration in May during Alumni Weekend. And we will be talking about, the history and the evolution of the Women's Center and women's studies. And we will also be recognizing our colleagues in Penn Violence Prevention, which is a space that grew out of the Women's Center several years ago, and celebrate the work of our colleagues in special services who are also here today because of the sit-in in 1973. The folks in that space are on call 24/7, offering support and advocacy for students who are in crisis. So we look forward to having that celebration in May. And if you have questions, want to get on the newsletter, definitely feel free to reach out. But thank you for listening to me. And I know I'm in the way of lunch. So thank you again to our panel here, and thank you for joining us, everybody.